Hello, I'm Sarah Kemp from the Applied Population Laboratory, and this presentation will be a summary of the report that I completed again this year regarding the enrollment projections for the school district. So to begin with, we look at the past projections and how last year's projections compare to the actual enrollment this year. I'll then go through the background information that's required to inform the projections. I'll explain the methodology and the different models that we provide. And then finally, we'll conclude with the actual projections and what you might expect going forward in your student enrollment. So first, if we look at the past projections, this is part of the table that's in the report, and it's showing the percent error broken down by the entire district as well as the grade groupings. And if we look at these if we compare it to last year's projections and the two prior projection years, I'm just going to emphasize first last year's projections, and we see that overall, the baseline was about only 19 under projecting and 19 students under projection versus the 5-year trend, which over projected just slightly by 19 students. So overall, the projections were fairly accurate for the district as a whole. If we look at it by grade grouping, both the elementary and the middle school projections were quite accurate this year. And then if we look at the high school projections, we see an under projection from what you currently have in high school enrollment. And this has been true actually for the last couple of years. There may be an effect, a COVID effect here, but it looks like the models have been under projecting the high school enrollment. So if we look at the background information required to generate the projections, we look at the district enrollment and how that hasn't changed, how that has changed. We look at the specifically the kindergarten population is important for us to look at, as well as the current births and what we might expect going forward in terms of birth trends. And then in your report, you're also getting some additional information on population, general population, and housing development that is just general information for you to look at as we look at the entire district. So if we look at the student enrollment over the last 10 years, this graph is showing that trend, and you have seen an increase of about almost 10% over this 10-year window. As you know, the last couple of years, you've seen a slight decline in enrollment, largely due to the pandemic and the effects of enrollment due to the pandemic. But overall, almost a 10% increase. And if we look at that breakdown by grade grouping, at the very bottom is the 4K enrollment. There's been a 10% decline in 4-year-old kindergarten enrollment. You're currently at 443 students this year. If we go at the top of the graph, we see the elementary grades, K through 5. There's been an increase of 4.4% over this 10-year time period. And then the red line shows the middle school, which is also increased a little bit more than the kindergarten at 6.4%. And then if we look at your high school enrollment, that is where we've seen the most growth in the district at 25% increase from 10 years ago. If we look at specifically the kindergarten enrollment and the trends that we've seen over the last 10 years, that's the red line, we see fairly steady kindergarten enrollment, a slight decline. However, if we look at a 5-year trend, you have seen this decrease, again, largely that drop from 2019 to 2020. Was quite significant, and so this trend is declining quite a bit. However, if we look at the births, we see an exact opposite trend. If we look at an 8-year trend of births, which is the red line, we see a slight increase in the number of births in the municipalities within the school district. And this does not include any of the city of Madison that is part of the district. But if we look at the last 7 years, a more recent trend, we see that that is increasing over time, especially the last 4 years. You've seen an increase in birth numbers over the last 4 years. And then if we look at the overall housing, you have it by municipality in your report. This is just showing the figure that breaks it down by housing type. Over the last 5 years, you've seen about 218 new single-family homes, which would indicate that there would be an in-migration of students over the last several years. The multifamily units have also increased quite a bit in both the city of Sun Prairie and the city of Madison. However, you typically don't see quite as many students from multifamily units as you do from single family units. So as we move to the projection process in terms of the methodology that we use at the Applied Population Laboratory, I'll explain that method, and then I will also go through the 4 different models that we provide to you. So if we look at the grade progression ratio method, this is a very common method, or you could call it the cohort component method, where we progress the students from grade to grade. And so what we do is we take the annual grade progression ratios, we calculate them for each grade pair over these last 10 years. And then we average those ratios in a 5-year, a 10-year, a 5-year, and a 3-year average to determine each of those projection models. And so if we look at an example here, we see the 3-year trend numbers, the ratios at the bottom of the chart there. If we look at the ratio 1.025, we use that ratio to project future first graders for next year. So if we take the current kindergartners in the school year and we multiply it by that ratio, it will give us the number of first graders you might expect for next school year. This chart is then showing those grade progression ratios in those grade groupings and how those 3 trends have varied over each of these grade pairings from birth to kindergarten to your 11th to 12th grade. And so you can see this, that anything above 1 is indicating an in-migration of new students. And anything below 1 means you're losing students from one grade to the next. We do treat the 4-year-old kindergarten a little, we kind of treat it separately. We determine the birth to 4K ratio, just as we've determined the birth to kindergarten ratio. We do this for the 4K as well. And you see here the baseline, the 5-year and the 3-year. The average has been anywhere between 85 to 91% of the births that occur within the district enter 4K 4 years later. And what we do for projecting those 4-year-old kindergartners, what we've done with this current model year or method, we model for this current school year, we are going to use that 10-year grade progression ratio for all of the 4 models that you see in the report. The 4K to kindergarten ratios are just there in that chart to give you some sense of what you're seeing in terms of number of students progressing from 4K to K, but they are not used in the models. So as we move to explaining the 4 models that are provided using this method, we provide the 10-year grade progression ratio, looking at those ratios to project first graders through 12th graders. And then we use that long term, which you remember was slightly increasing, to project future kindergartners. With the 5-year trend and the 3-year trend, we use the 5-year grade progression ratios and the 3-year ratios for the 3-year trend to project out grades 1 through 12. And then to determine the kindergarten enrollment, we look at that recent birth trend, which again is increasing. We use that recent birth trend to project future kindergartners. And then our final model does not use birth trends, but instead uses kindergarten trends to project future kindergartners. So we take those 5-year grade progression ratios for grades 1 through 12 to move those students forward using those ratios, but then use a kindergarten trend to project future kindergartners. So if we look at now what we might expect going forward in terms of student enrollment over the next 1 to 10 years, we look at the district total. We're seeing fairly steady to slightly declining enrollment if we look at it for pre-kindergarten all the way up through 12th grade. You're going to see a slight decline of about 3% over the next 3 years, and then it levels off after that. And then if we look at the elementary school projections, we're seeing a continued decline for the next 2 to 3 years, and then likely to see some increasing as those future births enter kindergarten and move forward. If we look at the middle school, we see a slight decline next year and then an increase in enrollment in middle school. And then in the high school grades, we see a slight increase next year and then some decline following for several years. So to summarize the projections going forward over the next 5 years, that PK to 12 enrollment will likely see some decrease, averaging about a 3% decline, at anywhere between 2.2 and 3.8, almost 4%, depending on which model you're looking at. And so we're looking at maybe about 180 to over 300 students decrease in the total population. If we look at elementary enrollment, here we'll also see a decline of about 66 to about 100, over 180 students, which would be about a 3.6% decline. And then middle school, this is where you're seeing the most steady enrollment, anywhere between losing 45 to gaining 23 students, averaging only a decrease of about 0.5%. And then if we look at high school, you are likely to see some decline there, averaging about a 6% decline, anywhere between 155 and 166 students over the next 5 years.